Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, welcome to a new video, and I am currently taking a little bit of a break, taking a little bit of a rest from this YouTube thing. However, I'm still keeping up with latest album, EP, single releases, whatnot. And I've decided to come back in a brief video talking about some albums that didn't make it onto my year-end list, but were just shy of making them. So they kind of land in this weird area of forgetting about them next year, or this loved list, the top 30 albums. They're in this weird area because I do want to remember them, but I didn't like them enough to put them on my year-end list. It was a tight year-end list, but I think these albums really need to be mentioned. So we're gonna start off. There's 10 albums. I don't want to be, putting out like a 15 honorable, 20 honorable, even a top 30 honorable mentions. I just want to do 10. 10 honorable mentions and whatnot. These are in no particular order, by the way, so don't think like, hey, he likes this album. This would be like 31 or 32, top 33 albums. No, it's not like that. Alright, these are just some honorable mentions that I wanted to talk about in a brief video. Like I've said, let me just roll through these albums and kind of talk about them briefly. The first album I want to shout out is the latest album from Danny Brown, You Know What I'm Saying? Because I saw great maturation in this album from Danny himself, and while he still has that cynicism and that cynical attitude, and you can laugh at a lot of the jokes on there, there's a lot of adulting or just maturing done on this album. And a great deal of this album is not spent making, sex jokes and whatnot. This is pretty adult-like from Danny Brown. It is a great album. Don't sleep on it. I really do like the production of this album. I like the flows on this album. And while this isn't one of his more experimental outputs, this is easily his most accessible one yet. Maybe next to Old. Old was pretty accessible, but still, I think this is a good album to please the fans. The next album I want to shout out is the latest album from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds titled Ghosteen, a follow-up to their 2016 album Skeleton Tree, which was mainly around the idea of death. And like I said in my review, Ghosteen, I think, is a representation of the beautiful afterlife that comes after death. Now, I didn't really include this album on my list, mainly because I felt like a lot of the instrumental palettes on this album weren't fully formed. It is a beautiful album with very ethereal soundscapes and very well textured instrumentation, but I felt like a lot of the synthesizers on this thing were basic, easily programmed, like the second or third preset in a normal synthesizer. Either way, the production on this album is very pristine, very beautiful, and it locks in a lot of the emotions that you feel, because you are sad, but you're like happy for this person. It's this weird in between, like you're crying because you're happy kind of feeling. And I think Nick Cave did a really good job at expressing his emotions on this album. I mean, he is a very good vocalist and a good lyricist. However, I think he did a really good job on this album just expressing how he feels. I also love the track Ghosteen. If it was a single on its own, it would definitely rank on my top 30 singles of the year list without a doubt. And this is a good album. Do not sleep on it. I know a lot of people love this album, but personally for me, I liked it. I really did like it, but it wasn't something that I was going back to over and over and over again like some of the other albums on my year-end list. Don't miss out on it though. Don't miss out. The next album I'm going to point out is the latest Floating Points album, Crush. Floating Points is an IDM electronic music producer who really came through with one of his better albums yet. And while this is, I'm not going to lie, this kind of grew off on me a little bit. Just like the smallest amounts. I still find a lot of the textures on this album to be very dense. This album as a whole is a cerebral experience from front to back. Even if I think it kind of drags down a little bit at the last 2 tracks, or even the last 4 tracks, I still think this is a very solid release. And I hope Floating Points can just go up from here at this point. He really does have something that utilizes the pioneers of ambient and IDM and really captures that feeling and that energy into an album like this. Crush is a really good follow-up to his debut album, and I'm very excited to see where he can go from here. The next album I'm going to point out is the new Anderson .Paak album Ventura, which is an amazing soul album. But not only just a soul album, it uses elements of funk, but it all comes together in a beautiful way. It's all tied up in this very nice bow, and I love the ending of this album with the Nate Dogg feature. I really think this is an album that Anderson .Paak took a lot of time to work on, even if it came out like months after Oxnard. However, I feel like these were both in the works. Like, they were in the works at the same time, and he just happened to be done with Oxnard first. Either way, I still find it a very interesting, a very emotive, and a very groovy and soulful album. Definitely a highlight in Anderson .Paak's discography, and he had a great year this year. He landed on 3 placements on my top 30 singles of the year. This one might be a little hypocritical of me, but I'm going to put the Rapsody album Eve on this list, and I'll explain why that's a little hypocritical. Because I said in my review that she is one of the most underrated MCs in today's age, in today's entire landscape of conscious hip-hop artists, and I kind of underrated her. Not like, oh, I didn't expect a lot from her. No, I mean, I'm putting this as an honorable mentions instead of putting it on my albums list. I guess the one problem with this album that just made me not go back to it as much was the runtime of this. It's about an hour long, and while some of the songs flow nicely into one another, this isn't an entire concept album like a To Pimp a Butterfly or just a Kendrick project in general is. And I know Kendrick's not the only conscious hip-hop artist, but in a way this album is like conscious songs put together and made a conscious album, referencing the biblical character Eve on the title of this thing, and a lot of black women on the titles of the songs. I think all of them are black women, if not women of color, either way. These songs are very interesting, they're very unique, and a very interesting concept went into this album. However, I didn't think it executed it complete and perfectly. There's still some flaws here and there, and again, I see Rapsody going up from here, and if she doesn't, then I'm going to be severely disappointed. The next album I want to point out is the latest album from Starr titled One of the Best Yet. In a way, this is a posthumous release because Guru, one of the 2 members of Starr, passed away in 2010, but DJ Premier decided to put together some leftovers that Guru recorded prior to his death, and he constructed them in such a way that it made me feel like this was a very last hurrah for the 2. A lot of what's on this album might be called filler. You might call a lot of the features on this filler. However, I feel that DJ Premier did a very faithful job putting a lot of these samples and a lot of these cuts into a good holistic album. And while it does kind of reek of that 90s style, there are some elements of modern hip-hop and rap today. They are on this album, but they're not very apparent. And look, I'm not saying that it sounds dated, it sounds old. Starr had this sound. I'm not complaining, I'm just kind of stating the obvious. However, I still think this is a very solid project, and it ends the duo, one of the most iconic duos of hip-hop in the 90s. It ends it on a very high note. The next album I want to point out on this list, wow, there are a lot of rap albums this year, the new Denzel Curry album, Zoo. Now, if you remember correctly, or if you watched my video, or I'm spoiling it for you, Denzel made it onto 2 placements on my best singles of the year. One of them came from this album, the song Ricky. And that song, again, like I said in my best of the year list for singles, this song really embodies a lot of what Zoo has to offer. However, I think there are parts of Zoo that could have been polished, could have been buffed out, but nonetheless, this is a fun project. Nonetheless, this is a very fun, energetic, and punchy project, showcasing that Denzel Curry is not some kind of one-note artist putting out these one-note albums. In a way, he is putting out fun projects, and he's not someone that's having this thoughtful, meaningful album like Taboo, or deep diving into his personal life on Imperial. He's just having fun on this album, and I can admire that. Again, I feel like the track listing on this album can be a little spotty, a little dodgy at points, but nonetheless, this is one of the funnest albums I've heard this year. The next album I'm going to shout out is the latest album from Michael Kiwanuka, Kiwanuka. Kind of similar to the Anderson .Paak album, this is a very soulful album, but there's also elements of funk into this thing, and this is kind of the most stripped back I've seen from Michael. He really is an artist that I have high hopes for, and he just keeps getting better and better with each project. And this was, again, another one of those albums that was extremely close from making it onto my list, but again, there was just parts that were glaringly didn't sit well with me, and I really debated on whether or not putting this album on the list, but hey, you know, it did make it. It was barely making it. It still is a great album. Don't discredit this album. It shows Michael growing as an artist, and it shows him evolving even further than what he was on his other two projects. Still one of the highlights of the year, and the next album I'm going to shout out is the latest Tool album, Fear Inoculum. Tool, progressive metal band, fun album by the way, and while I saw a lot of people weren't as excited as this album, again, I stated in my review, this is Tool by the numbers, but didn't we just want Tool back? And maybe they'll come out with a better album next time around. I still find flaws about this album, and I said in my original review, there are moments on the album that I just am confused by. Chocolate Chip Trip is easily one of the worst songs they've put on any tape, any album, and it doesn't really cleanse my palate for the next track. I just get really a bad taste in my mouth going into the next track because of that song. It was a weird experimentation that just did not go through. However, a lot of the songs on here, I would say, rank in Tool's catalog as being highlights. The song Temptus is a amazing track. Do not let that song go under your radar, really. Do not. That's a great Tool song. Culling Voices is another good song as well. There are some moments on this album that I could say kind of go toe-to-toe with some of Tool's better works. However, as a whole, this album just doesn't live up to the hype that fans were giving it. But it's still a good Tool album. I really like this album. Don't discredit this album. It's Tool by the numbers again. Hopefully they can pull through on their next album, make it even better, return to form. And the last album I'm going to shout out on this list is the latest album from Mono, Nowhere Now Here. This came out really early in the year, and going back, I've always listened to this album, and I always thought, man, this was a really good return to form for Mono, the Japanese post-rock band that infuses elements of classical music into their songs, and on this album that is no different. There are moments on this album that I think are some of Mono's best, even if some of the songs on here kind of drag on for a little too long, like Funeral Song, but there are some grand and epic songs on this thing. After You Comes a Flood was going to be one of my favorite singles of the year, but it was just barely knocked off the list. And the 10-minute title track is impressive too. I think Mono returned to form on this album after a string of pretty lackluster releases throughout the 10s. After Hymns for the Immortal Wind, I really think they kind of dipped down in not so good territory. But I think this is a jump start, a kind of step in the right direction for Mono. Really, don't miss out on this album if you like post-rock with a nice classical edge to it. Check this out. I think you will enjoy it. And that's gonna wrap up this list. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. A little bit of a laid-back video, I know, but I'm on a break. Give me a break, okay? I had something planned for the week after my initial lists were published, but I'm still wondering if I will continue through with that project. I am working on a Pink Floyd Worst to Best, and I hope that comes out in January. I hope I can cross my fingers. But for now, you're going to have to wait. I have plans for next year. I will talk about, in my next video, reflections of 2019 as a whole, of me, as this channel, whatnot. Stay tuned, and I will also publish a album review catch-up near the end of the year. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.